This is actually our third in a series of hangouts we've been having of recent. The first one was with, in the interest of disclosure, the first one was with the spec team. We also had a chat with the air quality egg team yesterday.
Mhm.
And we're proud to have you on with the AirBeam, which is quite a lovely device. It's something I've been playing with here in Phoenix, and a few other folks in India have been playing with it as well.
Great.
The background to what we're attempting to do, Michael, is really to look at open source environmental sensing devices, and within that category, I include air quality and water quality devices, and to attempt to adapt and localize them to Indian conditions.
Okay.
Those could be typically, whilst the hardware and software is robust, what we would be looking at is enclosures. We'd be looking at community surveys, encouraging ownership, looking at how schools can deploy these devices, so on and so forth.
Okay.
And the way to do that, of course, is to work with developers, who knows these devices better than you guys. So, in a sense, these hangouts are a way to familiarize ourselves with the bigger issue of air quality, to familiarize ourselves with obviously the air beam, and then with that shared understanding, we've shipped these devices over to India as well, or in the process of doing so. So, with the shared understanding of these devices, we start to test and adapt.
Okay.
So it's a free flowing format. However, some of the questions, the wider questions we had were, start off with an issue of, what is the bigger picture air quality issue, as it were? What are the difficulties in measuring air quality? How do commodity sensing devices compare to, say, reference sensor devices that the EPA might be using? Why are there differences? Also looking at how enclosures make a difference to these devices in terms of airflow, ambient light, other challenges you might be facing. How does calibration work with PM sensors? That's a biggie. If you have a set of maintenance guidelines that you think we could follow regarding, once we deploy these devices amongst people's houses, how can we go out there? How periodically do we need to go out there to, say, clean the detector arrangement, or clean the optics, or remove the dust from the inlet and outlet valves? Things like that you might have picked up from practical experience and other deployments that you're involved with. And finally, if you've thought about community engagement and adoption, and how we might encourage drivers of adoption that, again, you might have encountered in other projects that you could share with us. So off to you, Michael, starting off with just an overview of air quality, please.
That's a lot. I don't know if I got it all, but I did some of those questions in your last email, so let me look it up so I have a little list.
Indeed. Just a summary. We could focus on the air beam in particular and some of the challenges you might be facing, or some of the opportunities that you might have encountered in deploying the air beam as well.
Yeah. So why don't you just go one at a time? So is that you want me to give you an overview of the development of the air beam?
Yes, indeed. That would be a good start, and perhaps something about air quality. I think air quality all of us are fairly familiar with, so perhaps with AirBeam, in the interest of time, you could tell us a little bit about the background of the AirBeam, please.
Okay, so it's been about 4 years that we've been playing with air quality sensors. We started off doing gas sensing with metal oxide sensors, and then we did some gas sensing with electrochemical sensors. And then we also started experimenting with the commodity dust sensors that are light scattering devices. We used initially the PPD42NS made by a company called Xinyi, and found that it wasn't sensitive enough at low concentrations to be of much use for ambient air quality monitoring. So we switched to another unit called the PPD60PV, also made by Xinyi, and this is the sensor that's inside of the air beam. This is a sensor that is sensitive to ambient light, and so you need to design an enclosure that blocks that out while also ensuring an airflow. By design, the sensor is designed to pull air in through the sensing chamber using convection, a convection current generated by a heating element, which is a resistor. This doesn't really work well in outdoor conditions when you have wind and temperature differences, and so we added a fan. And so that's how the AirBeam works. Basically, we got this sensor inside, and we engineered an airflow and designed an enclosure to block out ambient light.
Wonderful, wonderful. What are the differences between the 60 and the 42? I mean, does it use a better LED or does it approximate a laser? Where are them? Right.
So I don't know enough about the hardware to tell you exactly what the differences are,
Sure.
because some of them aren't just based on things you could observe with the naked eye, meaning I can tell there's a difference in the way that the detector is set up. I can tell you there's a difference in the way that, the way it appears. But obviously there's things that are happening inside the circuit board and on the circuit board that I'm not an electrical engineer. I can't clue myself into. There is a resource on our website, on our blog, I should say, takingspace.org. So if you go to takingspace.org, and let me see, and there is a post. Let me see if I can get it real quick for you guys. Maybe I can share it on this. And there was an engineer by the name of Tracy Allen, and he did a teardown of the PPD-42NS and published that. So have you seen that?
Indeed I have. A pretty comprehensive document, yes.
Yeah, so that would be your best bet, and he would be a good person to talk to about, he has bought AirBeams and examined it. I don't know that it's very difficult to reverse engineer, particularly a circuit board, and then you're looking at trying to figure out, what is the wavelength of light generated by the infrared LED, so all of those things are difficult to reverse engineer. But so that's going to be your best, the document you've already seen on the PPD-42NS. And then I would suggest if you're interested in further figuring out kind of the differences, he might be a good person to get in touch with.
Absolutely. We'll follow up on that, Michael. Thank you.
Michael, one second. Michael, you mentioned you changed sensors from PPD-42NS to PPD-60PB because it was not sensitive enough, I believe. So how much sensitive is sensitive enough? How do you measure that? How do you have an approximation for that?
So we use, if you look on our, again, takingspace.org, you'll see we did an evaluation in partnership with NYU School of Medicine where we compared the AirBeam to a filter that was weighed and also PDR 1500, which is a $5,000 instrument made by Thermo Scientific. And so that's how we established how the AirBeam performs and characterized its performance. There's also a report if you type in.
How much sensitive enough? I'm sorry, Michael, you're breaking up. One second.
Okay. If you type in to Google Sonoma Technology AirBeam, you'll come up with another report that was generated by an independent third party, a company called Sonoma Technology. They also did an evaluation of the AirBeam comparing it to the PDR 1500. So that's how we established how accurate and sensitive the AirBeam is.
Yeah, I believe I've seen that document.
Okay.
Michael, regarding the, I should just mention that we have folks from various makerspaces in this hangout, so they might be jumping in questions along the way as well.
Okay.
One of our lead partners is Workbench Projects, which does a lot of cool makerspace stuff, hacker stuff in Bangalore in particular. So if you have interest in Bangalore or other parts of India, do let us know down the line.
Okay.
With enclosures, now the biggie seems to be enclosures with PM sensors, Michael. From all the reviewing I've done and speaking to other people, because you have in windy conditions you have to try and enable a similar amount of air to be sampled by the sensors if you can, and most of the expensive sensors use samplers for this. Clearly there needs to be some kind of enclosure, some kind of mechanism within the enclosure that could approximate the averaging effect that a sampler provides. Would you say that's a fair approximation of the difficulty? And there's ambient light, there's all kinds of issues when you go from an indoor to an outdoor environment. And given that the AirBeam is meant to be one of those things you can hook onto your belt and take with you, what have you found in terms of real life deployments on the field in terms of accuracies?
Yeah, the AirBeam performs very well, and it performs as well outdoors as it does indoors. Ambient light is no longer an issue. varying wind speed. You know, I've cycled with it, I've driven with it, I've walked around with it. The windiness doesn't seem to have an impact. This is something that needs to be evaluated further. But from my own observations, I haven't noticed a difference. And I think it might be because the sensor is not a nephelometer, nor is it a laser particle counter. It's a hybrid between the two, as Tracy Allen notes in his breakdown. So I think that in some sense it may not be as dependent on the volume of the air going through, right? So if I sped up the fan or if I slowed it down, there's kind of a you have some leeway in terms of how fast the air is moving through the device without negatively impacting the accuracy of the measurements.
Good to know. Very good to know. Could you explain those differences between the nephelometer and the laser and the hybrid nature? Would you have an understanding of that?
Yes. So a nephelometer would be you take a chamber and then you shoot light into it and you measure the scatter. And then a laser particle counter is basically going to be, you know, not this kind of larger chamber, but very precisely where the air intersects with the laser. And then you have a very, you know, instead of having a light source that's basically, you know, just shooting light into the entire chamber, you have a light source which is very precise. It's a laser. And so those are going to be different. So for instance, with a laser particle counter, although, you know, you'd need to speak to someone more knowledgeable than me, but my understanding is that, you know, you basically can have more of a problem with coincidence, meaning if two particles come in and they're overlapping with one another, the laser will only scatter off one of them, not both of them. And so you could see where airflow has a big impact in that system, whereas in airflow in a nephelometer, you're basically just taking a snapshot of every time you flash that light, so it doesn't make a difference whether the air is flowing very quick or a little bit slower, because you're always just taking that sample, you know, boom, 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 flash, flash, flash.
Essentially, you're looking at turbidity. You're looking at how, you know, you're looking at the overall sample and saying, okay, I expect a certain amount of light to enter from a clean air sample, but because of all these particles in it, there's the overall amount of light entering my detector is reduced by a certain amount. That difference correlates with the particle count.
I think it has mostly to do with the coincidence of air particles, right? So. And you know, so if I'm using a laser particle counter and I'm pulling air in really fast, I might have more of an incidence of the coincidence of particles overlapping one another. I might, if I speed it up too, and then I'm counting even more particles every second, you know. So it's that I believe that a laser particle counter is going to be more sensitive to airflow, air volumes being sampled than a nephelometer would be.
Right. And so the Shinye is obviously a hybrid of those, so one doesn't really need to worry too much about airflow speed and volume samples in a sense.
I think so. And so these are all things, you know, it's not a well-characterized instrument. I mean, we've done a characterization. It's better characterized than any other citizen science air quality monitor device, but it's certainly not as well characterized as, you know, a reference monitor would be.
Understood. Has anyone tried to get in touch with the Shinye folks, Michael? Because you know, Tracy Allen in his review of the Shinye does say it's likely to be a hybrid, but doesn't explain how it is a hybrid. You know, he says it's both particle counter and nephelometer, but doesn't actually go into how that could be the case. Are the Shinye folks, given how many of these sensors have been used in, you know, other devices, are they responsive? Have you tried to, you know, we could obviously do that separately. But how is Shinye about the fact that all of their sensors are being used in these devices?
I've been in touch with them because I ordered the sensors directly from them. They don't speak very good English, and I don't think they're particularly interested in a market that's thousands of units. They're more interested in markets that are millions of units sold. Right. And so they are interested, but they're not very communicative, and so I haven't had I haven't been met with a lot of enthusiasm by them. I mean, they're happy to sell some sensors, but they're not that enthusiastic. Got
it. And to be fair to them, I think they have a PMS-1 device that uses their sensors. So really, you guys are competition. That costs $1,000, doesn't it? Close to it.
Yeah, but I don't know if they really view it that way. I mean, I think they more just think, you know, if I was buying 1 million of them, then they'd be they'd be more receptive.
Right. I'm sure that'll happen down the line. I was the other things now with calibration maintenance. It will seem like a lot of community projects start off with good intentions. With the AirBeam, it's a robust package. However, if they're not maintained and recalibrated, that would be a huge. If one had a maintenance calibration procedure in place, that would be a huge boost to data accuracy and data completeness, wouldn't it?
So the AirBeam doesn't require any maintenance other than, depending on use, you need to open it up and blow the dust out of it.
Okay.
So it's very easy to do. It was designed to be opened and have that done. Take a Q-tip and just brush off the lenses.
Okay.
And in terms of calibration, it comes calibrated when it's sent out. But the thing is that aerosols are different in different locations and over time. So in other words, in New York City, where I live, you've got a lot of oil-burning buildings that are heating themselves with oil during the winter, as opposed to natural gas. That generates more particles. During the summertime, and also during the winter, you have people using wood-burning fireplaces, right? So and then say during the summer, you might have some issues with forest fires. So the profile of the aerosol is going to change based on where you are and what time of year it is. So that's the calibration challenge. It's not recalibrating it once it's been sent out and used, because the measurements will be the same for the life of the device for the most part. I mean, eventually the LED beam will dim, but I don't think that's over a long time, and it generally tends to basically just fail as opposed to dimming gradually. And so perhaps that will be an issue going out. But the bigger issue is, how do you calibrate because of the huge variability of aerosols that you might encounter? So for instance, a white particle is going to be more reflective than a black particle. A white particle might be something like wood smoke. A black particle might be something like black carbon coming from diesel exhaust. And so because black carbon is less reflective than wood smoke, it's going, even though you have the same PM 2.5 concentration, the wood smoke is going to register as a higher measurement than the black carbon. And so that's something that you can't, that in order to address, you just have to calibrate it based on the specific aerosol you're sampling. And so we've implemented at the software level a co-location calibration feature where you can stream data from, for instance, an AirBeam and stream data from a PDR 1500 and then calibrate them against one another using a fourth-order polynomial that the software server implements and then sends down to the app. The app remembers it and then converts from one to the other, right? And so this is a feature that's in beta that needs to be improved, but the architecture is there, the idea is there, and so it's not that difficult to implement. But it would be, I just don't have the resources to basically take it from beta into a working feature yet. But that is part of the plan.
Perhaps we could help you with that, Michael, if that's something that you're comfortable with.
Most definitely. Everything's open source, so if that's something you guys wanted to dig in on, you could basically look at the code and kind of figure out how it works and improve it.
Wonderful. Could you go into a little more detail regarding the fourth order polynomial? Because I understand calibration is where you try and attempt the true value of the measurement from the that is the measured value. So you look at temperature, you look at relative humidity, you look at other factors, and then basically pump your reading through a calibration equation, which then gives you a true value, or at least as close an approximation to the true value as possible.
You could do those things. Temperature and humidity offsets would be more important for something like metal oxide or electrochemical gas sensors.
Right.
Temperature and humidity, as far as PM sensors are concerned, it's more like if you have high humidity, you throw out the data. Or if you're sitting in a fog cloud, because what happens is that humidity will swell particles and encapsulate particles and falsely elevate the measurements. And this is a problem with all light scattering devices. It's just the physics of water and particles. And so we're not looking to do that. We're basically just doing the simplest iteration, which is here you have the values from this device, which is higher end, and you have the devices for the measurements from this AirBeam, which is a low-cost instrument, and you're sampling them simultaneously, and then you just do a best fit curve between them based on a fourth-order polynomial, and then that's how you convert. And so the math isn't fancy. It's pretty straightforward. The challenge comes in when you take two instruments and you place them together, you don't necessarily get the full range. And so what we need to do is, meaning you might do a sampling session and you're only sampling between 10 and 20 micrograms. So you're not going to get a really good curve. You're not going to get a great fit. And so what we're looking to do is basically, have it ship with a calibration curve, which is what's doing now, but then be able to shift that based on a simultaneous sampling or a co-location calibration. So the calibration would be based on both historic data about the performance of the instrument and that sample that you took.
Understood. And could we apply one recalibration curve, as it were, to all the sensors, or would we need to do them individually?
That's a good question. I mean, as I said, it's in beta, so it's something that was kind of like we got as far as we could with the funding we had and then had to stop. So yes, it would be best if you could do it across devices, but you also have to understand that there is some out-of-the-box variability. So if you run 5 air beams together, they're going to be pretty close together between 0 and 30 micrograms, but as you go above 30 micrograms, they're going to start to depart from one another. And so another advantage of the co-location calibration is that not only do you calibrate for the specific aerosol in that time and that place, but you also cancel out or compensate for out-of-the-box variability. So if you did a one-size-fits-all, even if you did one-size-fits-all plus co-location calibration and then try to spread it across air beams, you wouldn't be addressing out-of-the-box variability.
Understood. We have high RH values, unfortunately. Being tropical in nature, India, obviously Bangalore, Delhi, they can be quite dry. But generally, places close to the equator, like India, are going to have higher RH values. I don't know enough about the exact nature of that, but I would guess that they're pretty high. Would you say that to be the case, guys? Pavan, Agni? Relative humidity being quite high?
Let me just...
Well, I mean, of course, it's high. But so the question is at what point do the measurements become compromised? And so I'm not sure. That's something that needs further investigation.
Exactly.
And one of the problems is that it's not just the relative humidity measurement. There's something else going on where it could be lower humidity, but there's fog. And so sometimes fog, I don't know enough about meteorology to really understand what's happening, and we haven't done enough testing. But for instance, I was in Los Angeles recently, and they have something called June gloom, where basically moisture is pulled in from the Pacific inland. And so in the morning, I'm getting these insanely high measurements, but then I look at the reference monitoring site, and it's much lower. And the thing is the humidity wasn't 99%, but there was fog present. And so it was throwing off the measurements. So this is something that needs to be better characterized, and this would be really useful. Once you have these things in India and you're in a high humidity environment, on which days and at what level, what relative humidity measurement do you start to see that the readings degrade?
Understood. And then we would essentially rejig the calibration curve. So fourth order might become fifth order, so on and so forth.
No, the number of orders that you're doing is just how many points are you plotting on this line.
Best fit, yeah.
Between the two data sets. And so it wouldn't be a matter of like adding another order. What you would do is say, we're still getting decent relative measurements, right? So we can tell if one area is dirtier than another, but they're all elevated. So either you can do a correction where you bring all the measurements down, or you just say the data is garbage because humidity is high, throw the data out when it's above a certain humidity level. Right.
And we're going to have pretty high PM values as well, Michael. So we're going to have at the high end of the range as well. In Delhi and the rest of it, I think PM 2.5 levels are approaching about 150 to 200. Huge numbers.
So this is another thing to note is that a couple things. One, I want to mention, you can heat the air sample. So potentially, you could heat the air before it flows into the air beam, which is what many people do to dehumidify a sample. The second thing to say is that if you look at the performance data on the air beam, it's pretty good between 30 micrograms, which is great for the United States. And it's pretty, and then again, it's not as good, but it's still pretty good up to 100 micrograms. But once you get above 100 micrograms, the measurements are not as accurate. And so if you're going, and then once you get above, you really reach the detection limit at around 300 or 400 micrograms. So in a place like Delhi, you're going to be challenged because oftentimes the measurements are so high. And so
Right.
I'm not in an environment where I can test it. And so I would really love to see you guys deploying these in Delhi and find out how well it performs in that environment and whether anything can be done to modify it to improve its performance in a scenario where you have really, really high measurements regularly above 100 micrograms.
Absolutely. No, that would be part of our testing as well, definitely. Would you I love the idea that you've been using it when you cycle. I know a lot of the makerspace folks in India do a lot of cycling and running. So I'm excited by the idea of actually, having some air beams used by them as they go about their daily activities, and then, logging their values and cross comparing. So that's something we'll definitely be looking at. With regards community ownership, Michael, have you probably, with Habitat Map, by the way, awesome site for work. There are obviously other citizen science initiatives around the world that are using the Airbeam. Have they tried to look at how ownership can be encouraged in developing countries? I would assume a lot of these projects typically tend to be the US and Europe focused. But have you come across any in Asia that we could cross-compare with or reach out to figure out how we could encourage ownership in a developing country, like India, for example?
We've been trying, so we've been applying for funding to do deployments both in the United States and internationally. So it is a priority for us. We're not an organization, we're a not-for-profit organization, and our primary mission is to work with schools and community-based organizations to create planning and advocacy maps. So we do software, we do hardware, but really what we do is we work with communities to make maps and map environmental issues. And so we very much like to do this, and we've been actively pursuing it. Unfortunately, to date, we haven't got the funding that we need to do something internationally at scale. Our Sonoma Technology, who we work with, on and off, did do a deployment in India and also did one in Taiwan, but those were one-off. So we've been really looking to do something that is sustainable, that is an ongoing program, and to date, it just hasn't come to fruition yet in terms of funding.
Understood, Michael. We'll keep you posted. We're doing a little bit of surveying and trying to figure out what would motivate people to use devices like the Airbeam some more. I had a quick follow-up question, then we'll probably leave it up to, we'll open it up to the other members here to ask their questions. In terms of higher ranges of PM, you do mention that accuracy goes down. That's it's only to be expected. How would one use the on-the-fly, the calibration mechanisms? I know you mentioned it's in beta at this point in time, but ideally what you're suggesting is to get a reference quality reading from a co-located reference quality sensor, then use that. Could you use that for the entire network, or would that only recalibrate the co-located commodity sensor?
My suggestion for starting this would be if you can get access to a higher-end instrument, whether it be a state-run monitor or something like a PDR 1500, which is an expensive instrument at $5,000, but something that you could potentially get access to, or something like a dust track, you could basically, record the data from this instrument, the reference instrument, and then record the data from the Airbeam simultaneously, and then basically do a fourth-order polynomial best fit, and then you can look inside the firmware code, which is on GitHub, and you can just basically replace our calibration equation with your own, and then you can program the Airbeam with that and see how it performs. And then you could say, okay, now maybe we're interested in getting to the next level of complexity, which would mean contributing to the open source code and changing the way this feature works on the server.
Right, understood. You're talking the one in beta where you try and do a network calibration.
Exactly, as opposed to doing something in the firmware, which is I think would be the easiest approach.
We'll consider that, absolutely. Gentlemen, anything that I'm sure you have a bunch of questions to ask. Agni, do you have anything that you want to run by Michael, given that you've been doing some testing of the Airbeam as well, locally in Bangalore? Anyone else who'd like to ask some questions? You guys there?
Yeah, Vinayak here. Hi,
Vinayak,
Michael.
yeah.
I'd bought an Airbeam from you about 3 weeks back. I used the device here in Bangalore, and what I found was that typically during the working hours, the peak traffic hours, starting at around 9 a.m. in the morning, uh, the PM levels go all the way up to 188 when I get to the center of the city, and it kind of drops down back to around 100 123 by the afternoon. What I'm concerned is that your comment earlier that beyond the range of 100, the sensitivity of the sensor is not yet being checked. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, it's been characterized. So if you look at both our experiments, you could see that we did characterize it, as up to its detection limit. Certainly, more research could be done because we couldn't do we couldn't use the filter paper as the reference in that instance, right? Because well, for a whole host of reasons. So we only were able to use the PDR 1500, but we did characterize it up to its detection limit, and you can note in the characterization that it says basically that you have decreasing accuracy as you go above 30 and then above 100 and then once you get to 300 or 400, it basically tops out. But if you're seeing differences between, say, 180 and 120, I would say that those, and they're consistent, right? If you average them over minutes, or over an hour, you consistently see that difference, then that's the signal within the noise. So what you'll find is that it's just getting noisier and noisier the higher the concentration gets. But you wouldn't say that the measurements are worthless. They're just not as accurate.
Okay.
Michael, by this do you mean that in events where the particulate matter readings have gone above 125 in any sensing environment, is that noise, like sudden spikes in the readings?
So basically, again, so if you're below 30 micrograms and it changes, so if you have a measurement, it's 8, and then it goes to 10, that's a real difference, right? But if you have a difference, but if you're up in the range of 150 and it goes to 170, that could just be, that might make sense. But if it goes from 160 to 165, that's noise, right? And so what I'm saying is that, the difference between 8 and 10, that's signal. The difference between 160 and 180, that's signal. The difference between 160 and 165, that's noise, right? And so, basically you could see the higher you go up, the bigger you're going to have to say, if it jumps from 150 to 160, that's just not really any kind of signal. But if it jumps from 150 to 180, then yes, there's a difference there.
So ideally, it would be nice not to take measurements only once in an area, but look at co-locating and taking it over time then. So
I would say yes, particularly under these scenarios where you have higher concentrations, you're going to need to do more stationary monitoring and average the data over a minute or over an hour.
Yeah, Michael, we did try that, but the issue is when you do something like that, there's something like a median and then you have a standard deviation. But in the events where we were monitoring it, the deviations were much higher, like they were around 20 or even more. So we were not sure what to take as noise and what not. In certain cases where I was standing in the middle of the road right opposite the office to measure the PM values, when a car went by or there was a traffic jam, the PM values would go high to something around 125 from something around 70.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure if that would classify as noise, and that would be for a very short duration of time.
Oh, well, that sounds like signal, Agni. I mean, if a car is going by and it suddenly goes from 70 to 125, the obvious thing to do is wait for another car to go by and see if the same thing happens. And then you'll know it's signal, right? Or wait for a truck to go by. Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
Yes. The thing is, they're not consistent in this thing. So I am not sure, when... what the data, right? It might not be safe to just average it off.
No, I mean, remember, cars have different emission standards. Some cars will emit more than others. So just because you're seeing the same car giving you, I mean, the readings differing by virtue of the same traffic around you. I mean, there could be different emission standards. Exhaust could be less clean than others, so there could be reasons for why. I don't know. This is just my Michael. Any ideas?
I think you're absolutely right. You're not going to find, if in most of the time when you're sampling PM 2.5, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity because you're sampling this tiny, tiny sample inside the sensing chamber, and if you think about a cubic foot of air, it's highly heterogeneous, right? And so from one second to the next, you're going to have differences in that signal because it's just simply changing. And so most of the time when you're looking at PM measurements that are coming from regulatory monitors, they only give you 1 hour measurements because in order to have the confidence they do in their data, they want to average it over an hour to take out some of that noise and get more signal. The problem with that from a mobile standpoint is that if you only took a measurement every hour, you might have gone all the way around the city and you wouldn't know where to pin that measurement, right? And so there's a compromise where we're taking 1 second measurements so that we can look at what's happening at that exact point in time when you're standing there or walking past there or driving past there. But of course, you're going to be subject to more noise in your measurements. And that's not a question of how accurate the sensor is. To a certain extent it is, but it's also just a nature of the fact that you're measuring particles that are suspended in air. And one sample is going to be different than the next one by fact because that's just the way that air is.
Certainly.
Approximations. Michael, just a question. Ambient monitoring and determining what the ambient levels are is obviously a very important part, especially when it comes to screening and assessing. But I think down the line, one of the applications of the AirBeam, particularly because it's so mobile with the battery pack and the Bluetooth connected to the mobile phone, is monitoring fugitive emissions and trying to determine where the sources of pollution are in one's neighborhood. Now, the impact of wind in all of this is a major issue, not so much in sensing itself, because you just mentioned to us the AirBeam seems to be relatively insensitive to wind flow. How do we characterize the impact of wind on overall pollution levels? Is there some way of crowdsourcing it? I mean, the only way to do it is to determine the direction of wind and wind speed by using wind vanes or anemometers or devices like that. Are there other cool ways we could do it that keep the costs low and try and involve the crowd?
You want to measure wind across a city like Delhi?
No, it's just that I was telling the guys earlier, Beijing, for example, has done all these things to reduce their pollution levels, but Beijing happens to be next to some highly industrial cities, and the overall wind is blowing in PM from these other industrial cities that ring Beijing into Beijing itself. If we were to measure ambient levels in Beijing, they would still be very high. We would assume that the regulations that the state has imposed aren't working. But really, it's the effect of wind blowing in all this matter into the city of Beijing that's causing the ambient levels to stay really high. So the point is that this wind as a meteorological factor has a huge impact on ambient levels. Have people figured out ways to try and determine how the direction of wind and the speed of wind affects these ambient levels, and how the AirBeam and devices like that could be better used and to better monitor emissions as a result of wind? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the people who do air quality forecasts in the United States are usually meteorologists. Right. And so they're making predictions and forecasts just like they do with the weather, not just based on the measurement they collected, but they do it based on what will be the meteorological conditions, not just wind, but a whole host of other factors. So yeah, I mean, this is very sophisticated science. People are able to do this. I mean, in New York City, the Attorney General sued the Attorney Generals in the Midwest because half the PM coming into New York City is outside the region, and a lot of it's coming from coal-burning power plants. And so there's a lot of science behind this, a lot of experts that you could reference. I'm not going to be one of those people. But certainly, I mean, there's a lot of research has been done behind how meteorological conditions impact air quality.
Right. So really, getting in touch with our local meteorological departments and trying to take it from there might be the way to go there.
I think so. Or even in the United States, I mean, I would mention again this company, Sonoma Technology. They're a company, for instance, and there's more than just this one company who is hired by municipalities and others to do this type of analysis, where you combine meteorology with air quality forecasting.
Right. Got it. Gentlemen, do you have other questions?
Michael, before I read some codes that you had uploaded on the Airbeam site before for Arduino codes for the Airbeam before this, I believe. You had provisions for other sensors too, right? What happened to those sensors? Like, why doesn't the Airbeam have them now?
Because a lot of different reasons, but probably the short answer is that we didn't find those sensors to be accurate enough given the current state of the software. So perhaps you could use a really crappy sensor, but the thing is that then you need to do things like humidity and temperature offsets. You need to keep track of it, so you need to have a profile on it in terms of how it ages. You need to be able to compensate for out-of-the-box variability. So there are a whole host of factors that you need to take into consideration and address, and I would address it from the software side, in order to get a good measurement from a metal oxide or electrochemical gas sensor. And so we could do those things, and we have partners who would help us do them, but again, it's just a matter of funding. And so if you're looking at trying to get something out the door that can be shipped, calibrated, and then over time maintain its calibration, a light scattering sensor is a really good candidate, and so that's why we pursued that versus these gas sensing devices.
Right.
There's nothing such as interference from the gas sensors, right?
I'm sorry, say again?
There's nothing such as interference from gas sensors to the particulate matter sensors, right? Like, both of them can simultaneously function.
Yes.
I think one of the reasons Agni's asking that question, Michael, is we're contemplating the idea of trying to integrate NO2 and PM sensors into one package, not necessarily the same silicon, but at least co-located like the EPA is trying to do with the CSAM monitor.
We did an evaluation of our gas sensors on our blog, so you'll see there's a low-cost evaluation lab post that we put up. So you can access that. EPA also, EPA Office of Research and Development, if you do EPA ORD NGAM, which is Next Generation Air Monitoring, you'll see they also did a report where they evaluated one of our early devices as well as others made by other manufacturers. And so yeah, I mean, you can do it, and you'll get a signal. It's just that most of that signal is noise because of all the factors that I mentioned earlier. You got temperature dependence, humidity dependence, cross-sensitivity to other gases, out-of-the-box variability, aging, poisoning, and those are just a few that are coming off the top of my head. So it's extremely difficult to work with gas sensors and get good measurements from them. The electrochemicals work better than the metal oxide, but they're also, an order of magnitude more expensive.
Right. Vinayak, did you have other questions you want to ask? Michael, I think we have a whole bunch of questions to ask you, but given that time is short. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I was thinking when Michael said about the conditions of particulate matters crossing the range of 100, there might also be the conditions where the particulate matters cannot be sensed also. And thinking of out of the box, just for out of the box concept, what if the particles are like toxic, like in thermal regions, I mean thermal stations and all? What if the particles that are effective to the human health in more bad manner are not able to be sensed? And like in the places like Delhi where the particulate matters are too high and the conditions are that, sorry, we cannot measure them, then how do we face these kinds of situations?
So I do have to hop off after this question, but if anybody has questions they want to follow up, feel free to email me at info@habitatmap.org. That's info@habitatmap.org. So I don't know if I got your question exactly right, but let me give it a go and we'll see. It sounds like you were asking about which particles are more toxic than others?
No. What if there are particles that, when there are particles that we cannot measure, like high conditions and low conditions, what do we do then? How do we proceed with our sensor?
So you're saying the air beam is sensitive to particles in a certain size range. What about the particles that are smaller or bigger?
Yes. How do we implement our air beam so that it could match their conditions also?
So we're measuring PM 2.5 with the air beam because the smaller particles.
That was interesting. Go on, Michael.
Because the smaller particles are more hazardous to human health. The larger particles basically oftentimes get pulled out via your nose hairs, your throat mucus, and they don't have the ability to kind of pass through into your bloodstream. The very, very small particles below 0.3 nanomicrons or whatever, below the detection limit, yeah, it would be great to be able to measure those, but we don't have the capacity with this device. Unfortunately, that's just a limitation.
What is that a limitation of, Michael? If I could really quickly ask you, is it a limitation of the LED itself, the wavelength of light?
That's a really good question. I think it is. I think it's a matter of the LED, both the type of LED that you're using and the wavelength that it's operating at, and also the detector. So I think it's those two things that combine. But you also have to remember that if you're looking at PM 2.5, most of the stuff is going to be between 0.2 and 0.4. That's constituting the bulk of the mass, right? And so that's going to be where you really want to detect. And preliminary results from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health indicates that the air beam can measure particles as small as like 0.3. And so that's good, but it's not perfect. So yeah, but I do have to leave now. But please, if you have follow-ups, feel free to email me. And thanks so much for your interest. I really appreciate it. And best of luck with your work. It's really interesting, and I look forward to hearing not only more about what you guys do with Airbeam, but all the work that you're doing, because it sounds like you're an ambitious group and you've got a lot of great resources at your disposal.
Much appreciated, Michael, and kudos to you on the Airbeam. It really has started things off. It's been transformational in many ways. So kudos to you as well. Thank you for being a part of this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye, Dan.
Hey, Sriram.
Hey, Pavan. Should we turn off the air and have a quick follow-up?
Yes. So I'm just going to stop this broadcast, and then we can have our internal chat.
Wonderful.
Just give me a